Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your free guide to English studies and the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we continue our study of William Shakespeare's sonnets with a reading and analysis of Sonnet 10. Sonnet 10 is generally considered one of the weaker poems in the sonnet cycle, and for good reason. It's neither arresting in language, nor engrossing in thematic material. It does, however, have one redeeming feature in its favor, which makes it a quite important poem in the overall structure of the collection as a whole. And that's what we're going to focus on in this video lesson. Thanks for joining us. In this video lesson, the first thing we're going to do is read Sonnet 10. We'll follow this up with a plain English contemporary articulation of the poem. Next, we'll get into our analysis, where we'll argue that this sonnet is less important for its phonestetical qualities than it is for its role in developing the narrative arc of the sonnets. After that, we'll briefly discuss Sonnet 10's couplet tie, and be on the lookout during your reading, there's also a key word in there. We'll conclude things, as always, with some comprehension questions. Regular followers of this series know that here at ELA+, we believe that poetry should be read intelligently. Our method for reading poetry intelligently is described in our video lesson, How to Read a Poem. So if you haven't seen that already, be sure to check that out later. It's linked to down in the description. Now, the ELA Plus method of reading poetry intelligently starts with an individual reading of the poem. So if you haven't read this poem already, please pause the video here and do so. Once you're done with that, you need to read the poem out loud. And you can read the poem aloud with me right now. For shame deny that thou bearest love to any, who for thyself art so unprovident. Grant if thou wilt, thou art beloved of many, but that thou none lovest is most evident. For thou art so possessed with murderous hate, that 'gainst thyself thou stickest not to conspire, seeking that beauteous roof to ruinate, which to repair should be thy chief desire. O change thy thought, that I may change my mind. Shall hate be fairer lodged than gentle love? Be as thy presence is, gracious and kind, or to thyself at least kind-hearted prove. Make thee another self for love of me, that beauty still may live in thine or thee. And that is William Shakespeare's Sonnet 10. Contemporary English readers sometimes encounter difficulty in reading Shakespeare's early modern English. So what we do here at ELA Plus is follow up our reading of the sonnets with a plain English contemporary articulation on a quatrain by quatrain and concluding couplet basis. Let's do that now, so we can all have a general understanding of what's going on in this poem, at least on a surface level. It is shameful, but you can't deny that you have no love in your heart for anyone, since you are so unwilling to love yourself. Granted, many people love you, but it's obvious that you love no one. You are so possessed with murderous self-hatred that you go on plotting against yourself by seeking to destroy the roof that you should be eager to repair. Change your way of thinking, and I'll change my mind about how I think about you. Why should hate have a more beautiful home than love? Be more like yourself, kind and generous. Have a child out of love for me, so that your beauty may live on in your children, if not within you. And that's our contemporary plain English articulation of William Shakespeare's Sonnet 10. Now, typically in this video series, this is the portion of the video lesson where we define some of the archaic language often found in Shakespeare's poetry. To my reading, however, there is no archaic language in Sonnet 10. The poem is fairly straightforward and easy to understand. What's more, Sonnet 10 features no phonesthetic fireworks like we've encountered in the previous poems. Truly, it's kind of a bland poem. Helen Vindler, for instance, one of the great champions of the sonnets, describes this one as rather uninteresting. I would agree. Think of Sonnet 10 as a kind of unremarkable skyscraper on Manhattan Island. On its own, it's not much to look at, but considered amongst the towering tapestry of the other buildings of Vonnegut's Skyscraper National Park, it contributes, however negligently, to the overall beauty of the whole. That said, I would argue that there is at least one interesting aspect of this poem, and that is that Sonnet 10 helps remind us of how to read Shakespeare's sonnets properly. ELA Plus, if you'll recall from our Introduction to Shakespeare Sonnets video lesson, urges readers to understand the sonnets less as a collection of 154 short lyric poems and more as a single dramatic narrative poem, or more accurately, as a long hybrid lyrical narrative poem. In the remainder of this video lesson, then, what we're going to do is define the terms lyric poetry and narrative poetry, and then we'll review our argument for why the sonnet should be read as a long hybrid lyrical narrative poem. After that, we'll return to Sonnet 10 and show why it supports such a reading. Generally speaking, poetry has traditionally been divided into three categories: lyric, dramatic, and epic poetry. In this video lesson, while we do agree with this taxonomy, we are not going to focus on all three of these categories. For the purposes of exploring Shakespeare sonnets, we'll only be concerned with lyric poetry, and we're going to collapse dramatic and epic poetry into what can best be classified as narrative poetry. The reason we're going to do this is because, as we've just said, at ELA Plus, we believe that you should read Shakespeare's sonnets as a hybrid lyrical narrative poem. First, let's define terms. We'll do this by looking at various definitions provided by establishment institutions, and then we'll offer our own synthesis definition. Let's begin with lyric poetry. The Norton Anthology defines lyric poetry as a short poem with the original sense in Greek of being sung, as to a lyre. Today, the term applies to a short poem in any meter or free verse in which the expression of emotion, often by a voice in the first person, is given primacy over narration. Mary Oliver, in her great book, A Poetry Handbook, describes lyric poetry as any poem that is brief, concentrated, and has usually no more than a single subject and focus and no more than a single voice, and is more likely to employ a simple and natural rather than an intricate or composed musicality. Finally, we have the Poetry Foundation describing the lyric as originally a composition meant for musical accompaniment. The term refers to a short poem in which the poet, the poet's persona, or another speaker expresses personal feelings. From these definitions, we gather that the lyric is a poem that is short, and the lyric is emotionally expressive and personal. ELA Plus would therefore define the lyric as a short poem typically expressing a personal emotion or idea. One can immediately see why the sonnets would be considered lyric poetry. After all, in the 9 poems we've read and analyzed so far, we found short poems that express a personal emotion or idea. The sonnets are short, they're only 14 lines long, and the personal emotion or idea they express is the speaker's appreciation of the young man's beauty and the belief that the young man should reproduce that beauty by getting married and having children. Now let's turn our attention to narrative poetry. Remember that for our purposes, we're collapsing dramatic poetry and epic poetry into narrative poetry. Here are some definitions of narrative poetry. The Norton Anthology of Poetry defines narrative poetry as poetry that tells a story, as an epic does, and may be far shorter, and does not necessarily involve the epic's grander designs. Mary Oliver also describes the narrative poem as telling a story. It is discursive, she says, and it sets an easy and readable pace, and helps us to enjoy sequential events. Finally, Wikipedia defines the term narrative poetry as a form of poetry that tells a story, often using the voices of both a narrator and characters. The entire story is usually written in metered verse. Narrative poems do not need to rhyme. The poems that make up this genre may be short or long, and the story it relates may be complex. It is normally dramatic with various characters. Narrative poems include all epic poetry, and the various types of lay, most ballads and some idylls, as well as some other poems not falling into a distinct type. With these definitions, we see that narrative poetry tells a story and is generally longer in length than lyric poetry. ELA Plus would therefore define narrative poetry as a long poem that tells a dramatic story with a focus on character and plot. Only being 10 poems deep into the Shakespeare sonnet cycle so far, I can understand why you might find it difficult to believe me when I say that the sonnets are a species of narrative poem. However, considering the sonnet cycle as a whole, it is clear that they are indeed telling a dramatic story with a focus on character and plot. To support this claim, what we'll do now is offer a brief synopsis of the collection as a whole, focusing on the elements of character and story. For a more in-depth discussion of the sonnets, please see our video lesson, Introduction to Shakespeare Sonnets. Let's start with the characters of the sonnets. There are 4. We have the speaker, the young man, the dark lady, and the rival poet. You're already familiar with the speaker and the young man. These 2 characters feature in all of the Procreation sonnets and also a substantial portion of the rest of the collection. In fact, the bulk of the collection concerns the relationship between these 2 characters. If you're reading the sonnets as a narrative work, like ELA Plus suggests you should, then these 2 characters, the speaker and the young man, are the 2 main characters. Everyone else has a supporting role. One of these supporting characters, however, punches well above her weight. This is the infamous Dark Lady of the Sonnets. She does not appear until Sonnet 127, but she initiates a series of poems unrivaled in their emotional and psychological intensity. I mean, dramatically and emotionally speaking, this woman skates into the sonnets on a major penalty power play, bangs in 3 goals, and then body checks the teeth out of the entire opposition. The tumult, strife, and wrenching psychic pain she renders is truly something to behold. So who is this woman? Well, she's a married woman who appears to get into a sexual relationship with the speaker and perhaps the young man. Hers is a tale of love, hate, jealousy, unhealthy emotional dependency, and contempt. You're going to love it. Don Patterson describes the Dark Lady sonnets as an extended poetic exercise in misogyny, lust, post-coital suicide, and self-hatred. Basically, what you have here is Shakespeare in his Eminem era. Our final character is the rival poet. Not much to say about him. He's a true minor character if there ever was one. He appears in sonnets 78 through 86, and he provokes feelings of jealousy in the speaker, as well as a great amount of self-doubt. The central conflict between the speaker and the rival poet is that the rival poet gains the favor of the young man, and this causes the speaker all manner of emotional discomfort. So those are the characters of the sonnets: the speaker, the young man, the dark lady, and the rival poet. Character, however, constitutes only one component part of the narrative drama. There is also, of course, the other half, the story, or the plot. Now, in most narrative poetry, whether it be dramatic or epic, the story or plot is heavily emphasized. Think Spenser's Faerie Queene, Milton's Paradise Lost, or, more recently, I guess, Lord Byron's Don Juan. Don Juan. The story or plot in these poems is very clear. The story we have in Shakespeare's sonnets, however, is not as clear, and this is why ELA Plus considers the sonnets to be a lyrical narrative hybrid rather than a straight narrative poem. But just because the story or plot isn't so clear, that does not mean that there isn't a story being told here at all. In fact, once we get to the end of the sonnets, you'll be able to see the outlines of a traditional story, however dim and obscure those lines might be. I'll give you a brief synopsis of that story here, and it's something that you should definitely keep in mind as we read and analyze the sonnets moving forward. As you can see here, the first section is commonly referred to as the Procreation sonnets. In these 17 sonnets, the speaker urges the young man to pass on his earthly beauty to future generations by means of marriage and reproduction. We're in the thick of the Procreation sonnets right now in Sonnet 10. In the next set of sonnets, sonnets 18 through 26, the speaker abandons his project of convincing the young man to marry. Here now, the speaker starts to experience an increasing intensity of affection for the young man. The speaker becomes obsessed with the young man's physical beauty and their friendship and love. Even more so than in the first 17 sonnets, the speaker worries about the effect of time's all-consuming waste. Mere procreation will not satisfy the speaker's desire to preserve the young man's beauty. Now the speaker tells the young man that there is only one way to emerge victorious against time's ravages. The young man will not gain immortality through reproduction. he'll gain immortality through the speaker's everlasting poetry. Well, it's been over 400 years, so the speaker's not wrong yet. In Sonnets 27 through 101, the bulk of the cycle, this intensity of affection continues to build, but we also start to see feelings of insecurity and turmoil emerge in the speaker's thoughts about the young man. At one point, the young man has cheated the speaker or done the speaker wrong somehow. This ensnares the speaker in a thicket of jealousy and anger and self-doubt and frustration. The poems in this section are poems of tremendous emotional upheaval. When you hear people say that Shakespeare's sonnets are a treasure trove of human wisdom and emotion, they're probably thinking of a poem somewhere within this section of the sonnets. In the concluding portion of the young man section, Sonnets 102 through 126, we find the speaker coming to terms with his relationship with the young man. The speaker apologizes for being cold to the young man. The speaker also forgives the young man for any of his transgressions. And that brings us to the Dark Lady Sonnets. A general convention in the literature divides Shakespeare's sonnets simply into the young man sonnets of 1 through 126 and the Dark Lady sonnets of 127 through 154. We spoke about the Dark Lady already, so I won't dwell any longer on these sonnets. We'll get into them eventually in our reading and analysis. We'll have plenty of time to deal with her. The final two sonnets, like the concluding couplet of a Shakespearean sonnet, one could say, provide a thematically relevant and pointed ending to the collection. Some scholars lump these final two sonnets into the Dark Lady sonnets. That makes a certain amount of sense, I suppose, given that these two sonnets are about sexual passion, a major theme of the Dark Lady sonnets. But I also agree with those scholars who place these two poems separate from the Dark Lady sonnets. So we can call these the two Cupid poems. The thesis of these two poems is quite simple. Sexual love will burn you. You'll see what I mean when we get to those. Let's just say for now that these two sonnets can also serve as worthy additions to any human sexuality class where the topic of STDs comes up. Okay, so we have it that Shakespeare's sonnets feature both characters and, however vague, plot. That's why we consider the collection to be more than a simple collection of short lyric poems, and more of a lyrical narrative hybrid poem. And that brings us back to the subject of today's video lesson, Sonnet 10. As we said earlier in the video lesson, Sonnet 10 does not really provide any great opportunity to explore phonesthetics, but it does give us a chance to note and think about the narrative development of the sonnet cycle as a whole. It does this through the speaker and his frustration with the young man. To see how, let's look first at line 5. Here we read, "For thou art so possessed with murderous hate." This is strong language, tough language, a language of emotional turmoil. It stands in contrast to the emotional register we've encountered from the speaker in the previous 9 poems. Yes, we did get a hint of it in Sonnet 9, but that may have just been a one-off. Here, however, we see that this frustration is actually a bit of character development. Remember from our discussion of the narrative arc of the sonnets, we're soon going to move from the procreation sonnets to the portion of the young man sonnets where the speaker abandons his project of trying to get the young man to reproduce, and into a portion of the sonnets where the speaker decides that instead he wants the young man to preserve his beauty through immortal poetry. Like in all great narratives, plot is driven by character. Here in Sonnet 10, the speaker is starting to get frustrated over his inability to get the young man to settle down and reproduce. This frustration, this character development, gets him to change his approach, and therefore, a change in the plot of the sonnets is imminent. This idea of character developments in the sonnet in general, and Sonnet 10 in particular, continues in the concluding couplet. Here we read, "Make thee another self for love of me, that beauty still may live in thine or thee." There are any number of things to talk about concerning this couplet. Let's start with what Catherine Duncan Jones, editor of the Arden Shakespeare Sonnets, says about them. She draws our attention to the fact that here in Sonnet 10, we get our first indication that the speaker is personally involved with the young man. That's right. Up until now, if you didn't know anything about the sonnets as a whole, you would not have any textual basis on which to stand if you were going to argue some close connection between this speaker and the young man. Go ahead and review the previous 9 sonnets. There is no special relationship between the two characters to speak of. But here, in the concluding couplet, the speaker speaks of the young man's love. The young man's love is love of me, the me being the speaker himself. Further, as it pertains to the narrative development, Duncan Jones has this to say about the couplet. Quote, "We might expect the final emphasis to fall on thine, rather than on the youth's own continuance. And it would have been easy for Shakespeare to have written love of mine, thee or thine. That he did not do so may prepare for a movement away from the theme of procreation towards that of loving friendship." End quote. Again, this is subtle and slow development, not only of character, but of plot as well. Katherine Duncan Jones is not alone in noting these dramatic elements of Sonnet 10. The great Shakespeare sonnet scholar Helen Vendler agrees. She writes, "Shakespeare is especially concerned, I think, to punctuate his sequence with moments of visible drama. It is on these dramatic turns that all the putative reconstructions of the narratives behind the sequence have been based. Sonnet 10 is the first poem to use the first-person singular I and me. Such a moment in lyric is the equivalent of the entry of a new dramatis persona on the stage. Its effect cannot be overestimated." We'll leave our analysis of Sonnet 10 there. We will, however, linger for just a moment on this idea in Vendler of the dramatis persona. Vendler writes in her commentary on Sonnet 10 that throughout the collection as a whole, it emerges that we should, quote, "distinguish Shakespeare, the ironic author, from his speaker." End quote. I think this is correct. ELA+, in our argument that the sonnets should be read as a hybrid lyrical narrative poem, believes that the speaker is more Shakespeare's fictional creation than an expression of Shakespeare himself. We're not alone in this assessment, though there is a movement afoot in more recent years to identify Shakespeare with the speaker. One can understand this position, it's not unreasonable. After all, the sonnet as a form of poetry is a lyric, and the lyric, as we learned in this video lesson, is almost always, if not exclusively, written from a deeply personal perspective. But as we read through the sonnets, hopefully you'll come to agree with us that the speaker is less Shakespeare himself and more a Shakespearean creation, like Lear, Romeo, or Hamlet. And we've now reached the portion of our analysis where we discuss the sonnet's couplet tie. Sonnet 10, however, in addition to having some couplet ties, also has a key word. We haven't had too many key words yet, so to refresh your memory, a key word is a word that appears in all four component parts of the sonnet: the first quatrain, the second quatrain, the third quatrain, and the concluding couplet. The idea behind the key word was developed by Helen Vendler. Vendler wants us to pay close attention whenever a key word appears in the sonnets. She writes, "Shakespeare expended real effort in creating verbal connections between the body of a sonnet and its couplet, and the words he chose to reiterate in this way are almost always thematically highly significant ones." Now, the interesting thing about the key word in Sonnet 10 is that it's more apparent in the 1609 quarto edition, so let's take a look at that. Go ahead and pause the video and read this text. Can you identify the key word? Again, the key word is the word that appears in all three quatrains and the concluding couplet. Did you find the word self? Good job if you did. You'll notice, however, that most modern editors of the sonnets, all of them so far as I can tell, amend line 2 to combine the quarto words thy and self into thyself, one word. If we're reading the quarto version, however, we see that the word self appears in lines 2, 6, 12, and 13. So self is the key word of Sonnet 10. Keep this in mind for our comprehension questions today. And, by the way, if you're wondering why the S's in this text are written like F's, please see our video lesson, Introduction to William Shakespeare Sonnets. We explain everything there. Moving right along, we now come to the couplet ties found in Sonnet 10. Self, in addition to being a key word, is also a couplet tie. But we also have the words love and beauty as couplet ties in this sonnet. Love appears in lines 1, 10, and 13, while beauty and beauteous appear in lines 7 and 14. That concludes our analysis of Sonnet 10. In this video lesson, we first read the poem. Then we offered a plain English contemporary articulation of the sonnet. We followed this up by arguing that the sonnets should not be read as strict lyrical poems, but rather as a hybrid lyric narrative poem. We explored what lyric poetry and narrative poetry are, and then we looked into how Sonnet 10 supports this particular reading of the sonnets. Finally, we reviewed the key word of Sonnet 10 and also its couplet ties. And now, we move on to our comprehension questions. Number 1. What is your opinion of this poem? Number 2. What is lyric poetry? Number 3. What is narrative poetry? Number 4. Do you agree that Shakespeare's sonnets should be read as a hybrid lyric narrative poem? If so, why? If not, why not? And number 5. Why would Shakespeare use the word self as a key word in this sonnet? How is that word related to the other 2 couplet ties? And that concludes our video lesson on William Shakespeare's Sonnet 10. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who you think might also enjoy it. This video is part of a series of video lessons we're producing on all 154 of Shakespeare's sonnets, so be sure to enable notifications so you don't miss a single lesson. ELA Plus is a free guide to English studies and the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.